Welcome to This Week in South Carolina. I'm Gavin Jackson. Campaign season is heating up, especially in South Carolina, where Democratic candidates continue to visit the first in the South primary state. But that's not all. Last week, former Governor Mark Sanford announced he would run against President Donald Trump in the Republican primary.
But I'm here to tell you now that I am going to get in.
You're going to run for president against Donald Trump in the Republican race.
I am. I think that as a Republican Party, we have lost our way. And I'd say so on a couple of different fronts. I'd say...
Those were the words of former Governor and Congressman Mark Sanford this past week as he announced his bid to run for president. His announcement came more than a month after he said he was thinking about challenging President Donald Trump on behalf of fiscal conservatives who are worried about the skyrocketing deficit under the Trump administration. Sanford is also seeking to spur a debate on what it means to be a Republican in the Trump era and joins two other Republicans challenging him, former Massachusetts Governor Bill Weld and former Illinois Congressman Joe Walsh. But it'll be hard going for Sanford to gain any traction. He has about $1 million available, but fundraising will likely be difficult, and a desire to run a multi-state campaign his way instead of hiring outside help will also be a factor. In fact, Sanford won't even be on the ballot in South Carolina because the state Republican Party Executive Committee voted against holding a primary next year. But the Democratic primary on February 29th is still on, and candidates continue to flock to the state. Recent polling shows that former Vice President Joe Biden remains the top favorite for South Carolinians. Senators Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren continue to fight for second place, while Senator Kamala Harris and Mayor Pete Buttigieg continue to round out the top 5 in polling. Campaigns continue to court voters, especially the black vote, which makes up a majority of the Democratic voters in the state. But it remains an uphill climb for candidates in South Carolina to wrangle voters away from Biden, something candidates will be working at over the next 5 months. Joining us to discuss the 2020 campaign is Meg Kinnard with the Associated Press and Jamie Lovegrove with the Post-Courier. Guys, welcome back.
Thanks, good to be back.
Have a good summer? A little busy?
A little busy, just a touch.
A little tan.
Well, it's after Labor Day, and we're picking up, as you guys know, all these campaigns are kind of kicking into gear more so. But one other thing is kind of happening here in South Carolina. We've seen a lot of Democrats, a few Democrats jumping out of the race, but we've seen one Republican jump into the race, and that is Mark Sanford, the former governor and congressman. Meg, we've heard a lot about that this week. We've heard a lot of speculation for the past month about this. What is Mark Sanford's goal for getting into this race?
What Mark Sanford says, at least when he's talking to reporters, which has been basically what he's done since he officially got into this race a few days ago, is saying he really wants to have a conversation about the national debt. He says that none of the Republicans, none of the Democrats are really doing that as far as he sees as effective in the campaign so far. And this has always been Mark Sanford's baby. This has been the issue on which he has harped and that he's talked about the most during both of his times in Congress as well as his governorship in his 2 terms. So that's what he says he's doing, that he wants to insert that into the conversation. But what he's also doing is inserting himself back into the conversation. In between the gap between the end of his governorship and the beginning of his congressional term, the second go around, Mark Sanford was kind of at a loss of what to do. And we saw a lot of him then in media interviews and kind of just offering himself up for things. Well, now he's offering himself up again, only this time it's in the form of a presidential campaign. So we're seeing him a lot more on television. He's talking about his favorite issue, but he also has brought himself back into the national consciousness, which was also part of his goal.
And is this the best way to do it, Jamie? I mean, as a presidential contender, I mean, he wants to have a conversation about things that doesn't seem like people want to have a conversation about, and that's a deficit.
Outside of getting a cable contributor contract, I think this is probably the best way to guarantee yourself some significant airtime on CNN and MSNBC and Fox, which he's been doing a lot of over the last few weeks. He, of course, was talking about potentially creating a think tank to focus on some of these issues, and I would be not surprised one bit if that's where this ends up, a couple months down the line here when it becomes increasingly clear that he doesn't pose any sort of electoral threat to Trump. But he's been pretty clear that he does not think he really poses an electoral threat to Trump.
Flat out said he does not expect to win.
No.
I don't know how much clearer it could be than that.
But this is the way of starting that conversation. And I think what will be interesting to see is between the few challengers that have emerged to President Trump in the Republican primary, Joe Walsh, Bill Weld, Joe Walsh, the former Illinois congressman, Bill Weld's former Massachusetts governor. You know, they have taken different tacks so far in terms of the way that they are going after the president or going after the issues. Sanford, as we say, is very, very focused on the deficit and the debt and really not talking that much about Trump as a person, whereas Joe Walsh is pretty much exclusively talking about Trump as a character, as a figure, as a leader, and what he views as his deficiencies there. And you know, my sense, talking to Republican voters over the last few years, and those who are not supportive of the president, which is not that many, at least in South Carolina, but they are out there, is that I think there's more space in the field of the president's character issues. That when folks say they're Republicans and they've been Republicans for a long time and they're not so sure right now, oftentimes they'll talk about the tweets or they'll talk about the rhetoric that he uses against immigrants, you know, all kinds of issues like that. That's really what Joe Walsh has been talking about. You know, there are Republicans who certainly are concerned that the party has lost its way when it comes to the debt and the deficit, and Sanford will be speaking to them. But, you know, the odds that anyone is going to seriously take away from Trump's support among Republicans, you know, it's extremely unlikely.
And one of the things Mark Sanford said this week was that he wants to have this debate so he can make, you know, a better Republican candidate, make Trump better. But if you have someone like Joe Walsh who's out there really kind of going after, you know, these top line things when we look at, you know, why people have issues with Trump, which is his personality, not necessarily spending, does that mean that Joe Walsh is going to be more of a media darling than Mark Sanford when it comes to getting airtime to slam Trump?
It all just kind of depends. I mean, we'll talk about this perhaps in a little bit, but Mark Sanford's not going to be campaigning here. He's going to be campaigning on national television. That's basically what he's been doing so far, and I believe that that's the way that his campaign is going to continue. But he knows that he doesn't really have a whole lot of space to go after President Trump for a lot of different things. I mean, the president has already been tweeting several times about the Appalachian Trail and Argentina and all the things that Mark Sanford wishes that we wouldn't talk about whenever he is in a campaign or running for something. But that's reality, and he has to accept that. And so he is trying to keep that conversation in his lane, in the place where he really, you know, is focusing his attention, and that's the economics and the national deficit conversation. So, you know, some of the other candidates, Walsh and Weld, they are going to have opportunities that he isn't to bring in different sorts of, you know, ways to antagonize and go after President Trump. But ultimately, it really is probably not really going to make that much of a difference.
And, you know, I mean, I think the very first day of his campaign was almost symbolic in a way. I think, you know, based on all the reports that I saw, he clearly spent the day on a bus from D.C. to New York, doing cable hits in various spots, spending his time on the bus, calling up reporters all over the country to talk to them about his run. And that feels like, you know, emblematic of the way this campaign is going to be. He's going to be spending a lot of time trying to get his message out in the media. You know, with that being said, I think you and the AP reported that Iowa and New Hampshire are going to have primaries, unlike South Carolina. I'm sure we can talk about that soon. So, you know, they can spend some time on the ground there, too, and do some of their retail politics, and Mark Sanford really enjoys that sort of person-to-person campaigning, that you know, going and talking to folks in diners and just philosophizing about the issues in this country.
Of course, a statewide campaign versus, you know, presidential campaign, a little bit different.
It's a little different.
You know, all those other early voting states are a little bit different than South Carolina, like our Democratic candidates know. But Jamie, we were talking about that. You know, you're looking at you were covering the SCGOP Executive Committee, the state Republican Party Executive Committee voted last week to nix the 2020 primary. They said it was a cost-cutting measure, and also they have an incumbent in the White House that they support. Is this really just to make sure that they don't have any issues going forward with people like Mark Sanford, or is it just saying, hey, we've done this before, this is what we do now?
It depends on who you ask, right? So, yes, the stated reason from Drew McKissick, the Republican Party chairman in South Carolina, and several of the other executive committee members that I spoke to is the cost. The South Carolina Election Commission says that it would cost about $1.2 million to put on a Republican presidential preference primary. That's funded by the state, so that's our taxpayer dollars. You know, I'm sure you could make an argument, education's been a big issue right now. How many teachers could you hire for $1.2 million? So there is a legitimate argument on that point. What they, of course, also say is they point to that history, that track record of Republicans and Democrats not holding primaries in most elections when they have an incumbent in the White House. Of course, there is a counterexample, which is 1992, when Republicans did have a primary for George H.W. Bush, and Pat Buchanan actually got like a quarter of the vote here, and David Duke, the former Grand Wizard of KKK, also got 7% of the vote here. So they have done this before, and you could say that this election is frankly more analogous to 1992 than it is to those others, because we do have several former elected officials running for president. They say that they don't consider any of these folks to be serious, legitimate contenders, and we look at the polls, so we did the Post and Courier did a poll with Change Research in which we tested Mark Sanford and Trump head-to-head, and Trump beat Sanford 95% to 2 among Republican primary voters. What was interesting in that poll was we did ask folks, too, do you want a Republican primary, even if Trump is the only candidate, and 62% said yes. I think there is still a sense among the Republican electorate that there is sort of a Democratic norm that you just hold a primary and you give people an option, a way of showing that they either support the president or don't. And, of course, there are some folks who say politically for the president, it'd be better to have a primary to run up the score and show the support he has. So there's a lot of arguments on all sides.
He'd probably be doing that on Twitter. And again, we were talking about 1992 versus here we are, 2019, 2020 primary. I mean, things have changed substantially in politics and the landscape here. So I'm sure that it would have been interesting to see how this would have gone forward, at least in South Carolina. We'll see it possibly in other states. But what are you reporting? What was the fallout from that decision, from what you reported?
So what I heard when I spoke with Republicans across the state, as AP was working on a story, as Jamie just referenced, about New Hampshire and Iowa both remaining committed to having their early selection processes, whether it's a primary or the caucus in Iowa. But what I heard from Republicans across South Carolina, many of whom weren't willing to put their names to this, but the sentiment was exactly as Jamie just referenced. Why not have a primary anyway? Because that goes along with some deeply held beliefs within the Republican Party of a personal liberty, of a personal choice, of a, let's go in and just make our voices heard. And it also, some of the Republicans I spoke to told me, if it were to be as resounding of a victory for the president as some polling would indicate, well, wouldn't that give him a bump and a feeling of momentum going into any other states where there might be a contested primary election? So there was a bit of confusion, really, but also, again, these were people who weren't necessarily willing to put their names to this, because Republicans in South Carolina, even though the party does control all of our statewide elected offices, the governorship, the lieutenant governorship, and most of our congressional delegation, all of the state house is up for re-election next year, along with the president and everything else. But I mean, our state lawmakers, even if they are Republicans, strong conservatives, they're not going to be willing to speak out necessarily against their own party in any way because they're on the ballot. And so that's, what I was hearing from some of the folks I talked to. But again, there was a frustration that the party, that this executive committee, which is composed of several dozen representatives within the party, county chairman and other officials, but not representative of the entire party. It's not like they had some sort of a referendum where they really just put that vote to Republicans and said, okay, what do you guys really want? And so I think that there is a sentiment of, well, I kind of wish that this had happened for a variety of different reasons.
And they're saving $1.2 million. I mean, Mark Sanford, if he's talking about deficits and debt, I mean, maybe that could be. He didn't seem as upset as some of the other some of the other campaigns did.
Everyone knows, of anyone who covered Mark Sanford's governorship, he's a very frugal guy when it comes to the state's tax dollars.
Very much.
And just wrapping up and kind of along that vein, Jamie, he only has about $1.3 million in his congressional account that he can use if he transfers. Where does he go forward when you look at fundraising, potential staffing at this point, and trying to at least continue to get that message out?
Well, he's definitely got to start fundraising if he wants to last much longer than a couple months. I mean, it depends, though, on what kind of organization he builds. There has been some reporting this week, Emma Dumaine and Emma McClatchy, that, he's basically, and this is my sense, too, from talking to folks in Sanford's orbit, that he's running pretty much the show himself right now. He has been in touch with pretty much all of his former staffers. I've talked to some of them, and he's talked about how he's reached out to them, maybe kind of testing the waters on whether or not they'd be interested in coming on to help. But I think also just checking in with them for advice. So if he doesn't build an extensive organization, then he doesn't need that much money because he can run a kind of thrifty shop and
that would be very on brand.
It would be very on
very
brand. But one would think he would want to start raising some money, and there could be some avenues there. I mean, there are some pretty wealthy Republican donors, longtime Republican donors that are not big fans of President Trump. You could even potentially see maybe going to the Koch world, libertarians, sort of much more aligned ideologically with Mark Sanford and Donald Trump, and seeing if they might be willing to help out a little bit. My inclination would be that they probably won't, just because they're not going to give their money to a losing cause. But yes, if he wants to run any type of serious campaign, he's going to have to start raising some money pretty soon.
Gotcha. So wrapping up there with Mark Sanford, but switching to the Democrats, who will be having a primary in South Carolina.
They will indeed.
Definitely.
It'll be interesting to see who's still left standing, because we have seen some drop out. But recent polls over the summer show former Vice President Joe Biden still really maintaining his lead and not having any real big dips. In fact, a recent CBS YouGov poll this week showed him with a 43% lead, Sanders with 18%, Warren at 14%. Harris and Buttigieg wrapping it up. So this is good news for the Biden camp. I mean, they survived a summer. Other campaigns had some issues. It seems like touch and go here, but Biden maintained, and despite some gaffes here and there, it doesn't seem like it's been that big of an issue for him.
He is plowing straight ahead, and his numbers, as you mentioned, do remain strong in South Carolina. Again, though, and what we hear from voters, as all of us spend time throughout the state at these events, is there is still a feeling, a very strong feeling of positivity toward the former vice president because of his proximity to the Obama administration. Clearly, he was the number 2 ranking official in that administration. But when I ask voters, why do you like Joe Biden? 95% of them probably say, well, I really respect what he did with President Obama, or I like President Obama, or the Obama years were a good time for me, and here's why. So there is still a lot of that. I mean, Joe Biden came into this primary, obviously, with the highest name recognition you could possibly have in this Democratic field of candidates. So that automatically brought his numbers up. And they've stayed high because of a lot of things. But the responses that I hear from people, though, are not about policy. They're not necessarily about, well, I really like his ideas for health care. I mean, he's talked about what he would like to change with the Affordable Care Act, so he's not pretending that what he worked on in the Obama administration is 100% perfect. But I don't hear from a lot of voters who are really happy with how it's worked out for them either. So they would like to see something different happening in terms of that particular lane. But it's more of an emotional connection, I think, at least from what I've seen here in South Carolina, of I really like Joe Biden because I liked him in this previous time. That doesn't mean those people will go away. I mean, they're still with him. And there are some people I've talked to who remain committed and aren't even willing to list any other options. When I ask for who are your top 3 candidates, it's just Joe Biden and that's it. But there obviously are other people, plenty of voters who are still shopping. And Joe Biden may be in their top 1, 2, or 3, but they're not necessarily committed, and there could be a variety of things that would cause them to ultimately choose somebody else.
Yeah, and Jamie, kind of along that line, I mean, that YouGov poll, CBS YouGov poll, did show that one of the top reasons people like Biden is because of Obama, his connection, 85%, followed by his policy stances. What are voters telling you when you're at these events, too? Similar to what Meg's saying, what are people's thoughts on Joe Biden in this race right now?
Yeah, I mean, when you talk to folks who have personally known Joe Biden for a long time in South Carolina, Trip King, who was Fritz Hollingshead and got to know Biden very personally there, Fran Person, who was a USC football player, met Biden while he was there, became a top aide for him, and then ran for Congress here a couple of years ago. Something that I think they hit on well is that, folks in South Carolina, it's not just name ID. It's more sort of brand ID. They know who Joe Biden is. And Biden himself has said this in terms of, I've asked him, how do you explain how much support you have here? People know him on a deeper level, feel like they know him on a deeper level. They feel like they know him on a personal level. He's come to the state so many times over the years, more than a dozen times just since 2006, to speak at various events and to help various candidates campaign. So there are a lot of former candidates who also owe a gratitude of debt to the former vice president for that reason. So he does have that well of support. Of course, Bakari Sellers has sort of said this well. He's supporting Kamala Harris in the race. He's argued that Biden's support is wide but not deep in South Carolina. This idea that he has the most support, but a lot of those supporters are not necessarily necessarily going to stick with him over the long haul and could be persuaded to go somewhere else. That's what all of Joe Biden's opponents are hoping for. But what he's really benefiting from right now is the size of this field. While he's always polled by far the highest in South Carolina, it's not like there's ever been a poll in which he's had a majority of the support. The problem is that everyone else is dividing up the rest of the vote. And I think especially for some of those voters who will just go to Biden by default, it's partly because the field is so big. They are not going to spend all their time thinking about politics. Joe Biden's the one that they know, the one that they feel like they can trust, and they don't have to research 20 other people to get to that point. If the field was 1, 2, 3 other people, as it's starting to feel a little bit more
and the
like
number of campaigns that are actually dedicated to coming through South Carolina.
That could change the calculus a little bit and could change the dynamic for voters. So if that happens, if someone starts emerging and starts creating a head-to-head situation with Biden, that could change. But, for example, when Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders, number 2 and number 3, they are dividing that sort of progressive vote, and that's going to make it much harder to take Biden down.
And Megan, another thing people like about Biden is that he has the ability to beat Donald Trump, is what they say. That he's the most likely candidate to beat Donald Trump. So that has to factor into a lot of things, too. I mean, going along with what Jamie was saying, too, I mean, there's still time, obviously. We have 5 months, but that electability is something that people haven't really been able to shake from him yet.
Sure, and when you ask Democrats, really, what's it going to take? Whom are you going to support? I mean, that's their solid answer, regardless of the name that's attached to it. It's whoever's going to beat Donald Trump.
Right.
Period. Full stop. That's what I really care about. So with Joe Biden, for all the reasons that we've discussed, for his decades of experience in public service and even in some of the highest offices in the whole country, sure, people do kind of put him into that slot in terms of, I can see that head-to-head. I can see Donald Trump and Joe Biden going after each other on a debate stage and really competing, and I could see Joe Biden winning. So they do kind of just place him in that space. But let's not forget, South Carolina isn't the first primary that we're going to have next year. There's going to be New Hampshire, there's going to be Iowa, there's Nevada, and it's the first in the South, certainly. But what happens in those other contests is going to have a direct and immediate effect on what happens here. Certainly the field will look different than it does now. It will be smaller, who knows by how many. But those races and those contests that will happen will have a direct impact on what happens here in South Carolina.
And Jamie, I know he told you that it's his firewall and that he sees South Carolina as a firewall. I talked to Bernie Sanders. He's like, yeah, everyone says it's their firewall. But before, I kind of want to switch to these other candidates too, because we have about 5 minutes left. But Meg, you were talking a minute ago about Warren kind of peeling support off of these lower tier candidates, at least of what we're seeing her movement here in South Carolina. What's the explanation for that? What's going on with Warren versus Sanders as they battle it out for 2 and 3?
Sure. Again, as Jamie referenced a moment ago, they do occupy the more progressive lane of the Democratic Party. That's no secret. And voters are sometimes considering a choice between the two, really. Not necessarily all the time, but they recognize Bernie Sanders' name from his previous run. Clearly, his name ID was not as high as Joe Biden's, but pretty high coming into this whole campaign. So as voters, though, learn more about Elizabeth Warren, what I hear from them, and she's been spending increasingly more time here in South Carolina, not as much as some of the other campaigns, but she has been focusing on it more. What I hear from them is the more they hear from her, the more interested in her they become. And these are people who supported Bernie Sanders last time. These are people who really kind of weren't sure where they were going to fall this time on the spectrum. So some of them tell me they wouldn't even consider themselves being potential Bernie Sanders supporters. So it's not like they're just looking for a progressive candidate, but they see her, they like her, and they see also, some of them tell me, they see her electability as pretty decent too. So in picturing somebody else who's not Joe Biden going up against Donald Trump next November, it seems that some are starting to coalesce about thinking about Elizabeth Warren.
And Jimmy, with about 3 minutes, kind of want to talk about these other campaigns. We've seen Beto O'Rourke come through the state. He's rekindling, trying to get more momentum again. There was a pretty rough AP story out the other day about just how things are going for him. And then, Sarah Kamala Harris's campaign internal documents said that they had a summer slump. What are these two campaigns looking like in South Carolina right now, just generally? You can talk on that.
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of folks that are working very hard here. I would say the Kamala Harris campaign is one of the biggest organizing presences at this point. Cory Booker is hired very well in South Carolina. Beto O'Rourke has a pretty extensive team at this point and consistently gets really big crowds. All of these candidates tend to get pretty big crowds. And I think the question for a lot of them is how do they translate that apparent enthusiasm every time they come here into actual support in the polls. There has been a lot of talk over the summer about the enthusiasm gap for Biden. And this is why some folks like Bakari Sellers feel like there's an opportunity there, is while he's leading in the polls, sometimes it doesn't feel like that at some of his events. He's not getting necessarily as big crowds as a Warren is, as a Kamala Harris is. So, they are certainly all working very aggressively. Again, the problem just comes down to how do you distinguish, you sort of have a two-tack battle. You have to distinguish yourself among the sort of everyone other than Biden, and you have to distinguish yourself against Biden. And it's kind of difficult when nobody's able to get through the first part of that challenge to then become the alternative to Biden for so many voters.
And we have 1 minute left. We're taping this Thursday morning, so we're not going to be able to talk to the debates, the 3-hour-long debate tonight.
Right.
But we are going to all be at Galvin's Ferry on Monday. There's going to be a couple
will.
candidates there, including some big names. Meg, what should we be looking for at Galvin's Ferry, this big cattle call? Is it going to be kind of similar to what we saw with the Jim Clyburn fish fry?
This is going to be some old school politicking that only in a place like South Carolina we're going to have bluegrass music, we're going to have clogging to start the night off, and then we're going to be hearing from these candidates making their pitch literally on the stump to voters up in the PD. So it should be quite a night. We're not going to have as big of a crowd as for the Clyburn fish fry, but it should be some fun.
Yeah.
It should be fun. We'll be out there. We'll be doing a mini pod for the South Carolina lead too, and we'll be covering it for everyone to see. So appreciate you guys, Meg and Jamie, for both being on.
Sure, thank you.
And thank you for tuning in. And don't forget to check out the South Carolina Lead, the political podcast that can be found on your podcast app on any mobile device. Each week I recap the weekly political news with reporters who cover it, like these two. From the Kennedy Greenhouse studio on the campus of the University of South Carolina, I'm Gavin Jackson.